opportunity to speak here. Just a tiny correction, Personal Data IO is a non-profit, not a company. So indeed, it's focused on helping individuals exercise their rights, make their rights actionable, like really possible to exercise them in reality, and also collectively useful. But in the context of COVID, so I don't know how much you know of my background, but I was very involved in the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And if for those of you who know of the scandal, there's a lot of dynamics around social data, data about pairs of individuals or multiple individuals and the way this data was obtained. And I recognize with COVID a lot of similarities in the problem there, because after all, an epidemic, a virus jumps over social bonds from one person to another, or among other bonds. Also, the fact that you're sitting next to someone in the bus might lead to the virus jumping from one to the other. And so there are some of the same dimensions there that were present in the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And so I got really involved. That's the advantage of having a small organization like Personal Data IO focused on those topics, is that if there is something that warrants more interest suddenly, then you can go there. And so the individual data protection rights that would be concerned in this case are much more diffuse, much more harder to assess, but it's more around transparency of how data is used in this context, mostly, not necessarily access requests, for instance. So Nicola, I do have a technical question, which is, are you able to share your screen or
yeah,
or not?
Of course. You should be able to, no?
Yes, but I have some comments that I don't necessarily want to show, or okay. So can you share the document with, or the students have it in front of them, I suppose?
Oh, the document, you mean the Google Doc?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm gonna just go to it right now. So you don't want to show the one, the one where you have comments. You want to show a plain version, right?
Or, I mean, it's okay as well. I can do that. I can share that as well. Let me figure out how to do it.
Sure.
Yes.
Perfect.
Let me stop notifications. Sorry. Right. Okay. So so looking at this document, the first thing that which is an excellent assignment, broken into different groups and everything, I think we do have to take a step back. As I suppose legal scholars or lawyers, there might be an impulse in just getting drawn directly into the legal arguments, but you will see that very quickly in all those legal arguments, you do have to understand a little bit of the science and the approach a bit deeper. And since we're all locked into the same types of situation from our personal situation, right? We're all at home, I presume, or close to home. Then we have a lot of common background to understand what those systems are trying to achieve. We're all potentially subject to those systems, which is a great unifier in a sense to understand the situation. I mean, it's very likely that data about us is now being crunched on a server in our local country to try to understand better how the epidemic would spread in our own country, even if we're not infected, even if we haven't talked to anyone, there are statistics collected about us. And this data is going to flow through different channels all the way possibly to Geneva, to the WHO, to be analyzed and to help assess how the epidemic should be addressed at a macro level. So I think it's really important to understand this virus really in itself. And I want to insist that I'm open to questions at any time. If I make a jump, a logical jump at any step, or if Nicolo, you think it would be better to stop, I'm most definitely welcoming of this. I've literally spent the last 4 weeks just completely in this. It's going to take a little bit of effort from me to extract myself from being so immersed in data issues relating to COVID. You want to say something, Nicolo?
No, perfect. I'll keep the mic on so I can jump in at
right.
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. So, okay. So the first is to understand the drive to digital solutions to addressing the virus. We have a situation where there is a virus that is obviously a medical problem, a public health problem. And so far, the only solution we've been, beyond just treating people who have been infected, the only solution we've been able to come up with is a social response, is this isolation, the fact that we just reduce our networks to the most minimal expression of them, which is the household. In some countries, it's even worse because people are forcibly taken away from their households to be put in jail or to be put in quarantine or whatever you want to call it. So this social dimension, the social response is very basic at the moment, but in European countries, at least right now, there is talk of these restrictions being lifted progressively. So we see that it's a blend of medical response right away to the infected people and to treat individuals. And it's also a social response that is going to be very complex and measured according to these critically affected people who are in the hospital, essentially. At the moment, basically, if someone is at home coughing very severely but not at risk of dying, in Europe at least, it's actually quite good from a public health standpoint, because hopefully they will make it and they are getting immunity essentially, and they're not infecting anyone. So this is actually a positive outcome for the collective. If they were in a hospital, they might be slightly better treated, but there's probably people who need it more than them, right?
But
so,
sorry, Paul, we don't know that those people at home would actually have the disease.
Right. So this is excellent remark. So already now we see that we're messing up with the next step. The next step will be partly a digital response. It will be trying to understand exactly where the virus is, and it needs to be a digital response because there is a lot of uncertainty around this virus. So the virus is right now diffuse. We don't really know where it is, and we will need to juggle with risk and probabilities quite a lot in the near future. And right now we're already messing up that part of the response for reasons I understand quite well. It's because the urgency is on the medical response, is on getting people to confine, etc. So we're messing up the digital response in the sense that there's a lot of information we could collect right now that would help in the near future, right? Because we don't know who is coughing, we're not logging this type of information right now. We don't have their path history. Now, why am I insisting so much about particularly for COVID, about this risk and this uncertainty and all of those elements? Well, when other viruses spread, you can imagine different scenarios. You can imagine a scenario where the virus would spread, would infect someone, that person would start having symptoms, and then they would become infectious 3 days later. And it would be very clear by that time that that person is infectious. And so it would be a lot easier to treat because you would know who is risking propagation. The difference with this virus is that there is a substantial amount of transmission, it seems, when you are in a population that hasn't been yet touched by the virus. You have a significant proportion of transmissions that are pre-symptomatic, that are occurring before the symptoms are showing up, right? So that means someone is going about their life and at some point catches the virus, is not in any way aware of it, starts becoming infectious, infects on average 2 or 3 other people, and then only later starts showing symptoms, right? And so that's a problem, because if you don't do anything about it, then this reproduction factor of 2 or 3 is above 1, which means that the number of people infected will keep on growing until essentially a large slice of the population is infected. So you need to do something about it, and what we're doing right now is preventing people from infecting others by preventing them to move. But the hope is that we can track how people could potentially infect each other by tracking their movement, or the hope of some, by tracking their movement, so that when it does turn out that they were infected, because in this hopefully near future world we have enough tests, then we can go back in time through this log of previous encounters and figure out, oh, you might have been at risk, so you should do a test. Okay, so there is a huge amount of math and numbers in there. I do want to inject some of them in this discussion just to make it a bit more precise. But before that, I would like to stop to just make sure that people understood these aspects already. Does this make sense? I think Zoom has thumbs up. I think that might help in.
Yes. You can use a thumbs up.
Thank you.
Emoji.
Thank you, Manuela. Okay, for everyone?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, so just to give you a good sense of the numbers, it looks, to the best of the information we have, that on average, in a new population that has never seen this virus, which is the case around the world, right? This is true for all populations on Earth at the moment, or it was true for all populations on Earth a few months ago. It looks like, and this will depend on local lifestyles, on average, this virus, every person infected averages, at the beginning of an epidemic, 2.5 people. That's on average. 2.5 people means, so that you can also compute the breakdown. One of those 2.5 is after symptoms. So the fix there is pretty easy. You isolate the person and you prevent them from infecting others, and you protect those who approach them because they need to take care of them. Okay. 0.5 amounts to environmental factors, so contact with surfaces, things like this, or even people who never have symptoms and do infect others. It seems like that's possible. So the solution there is you disinfect public spaces, bars in the tramway, and things like this. You wash your hands, so on. But also one of those 2.5 that is pre-symptomatic. So this is huge. This is really a bad setup, because we need to fight somehow against this one on average of pre-symptomatic infection, right? So because otherwise if we just fix those that are post-symptoms and we isolate those, we're left with 1.5, and things are still growing exponentially. So we need to somehow figure out how to attack that. And that's the contact tracing promise. So when I realized this from the science that was coming out 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was like, okay, this entails a whole array of huge amount of things. It does mean that you will have to track, as I explained, the risk of people moving about, and you will have to understand exactly when you lift the measures, what kind of impact this might have on the propagation of the virus. Over time, it emerged that the virus had different impact on different age groups, different nocivity, like potential to affect the individual in terms of death, but also different potential in terms of propagation. It looks like young children cannot communicate the disease to their parents, to the best of our knowledge, but it looks also like young people, probably around your age, could highly contribute to infecting others. So here is a measure that would very, very much affect you guys, and that would be very, very impactful to reduce the spread of the virus. Is you protect all the old people in the homes, the retirement homes, and you protect them, and you prevent anyone from going to see them if they're not like medically trained, and you keep all the young people age 20 or 15 to 25 in really, really severe lockdown. But you allow the economy to restart because all the adults who have productive work, let's say, can go back to starting back the economy and being productive, right? So this might be a measure that is very good from an epidemiological standpoint, but that might be very difficult to accept by some slices of the population, might be very unfair. Of course, Nicolo, do you want to add something?
Yeah, maybe I just want to ask how you would define this risk group, because you mentioned the older people. Yes, we understand that the impact is likely to be much more severe on old people, but the risk group is broader than that, right? We could include a number of people that have comorbidity conditions.
Right. Yes, of course. So, but I think that's actually quite relatively easy, because in a sense, what's the outcome for those people? The outcome, to the best we can tell, is that they protect themselves, is to empower them to protect themselves to the best we can, right? So, and it's in their health interest. It's completely aligned.
My point was simply that it's a little bit a moving target, because we don't know exactly all the conditions that are likely to impact the success over the virus, you know. So it might be that at this time we understand people with pulmonary problems, you know, or with diabetes are very likely negatively affected by this. But what about, you know, some other disease that we have not taken into account when making this calculation? So I think that it should be possible to keep measuring also the people who are in the risk group and people who are outside the risk group, to see, you know, what the results of an interventions are.
Right. So that's very much true. And it goes much deeper than that, actually. So this idea of a moving target and collecting information is highly, highly relevant to this class, of course, because that is part of fighting an epidemic, is collecting data and realizing that this collecting data might have severe consequences, potentially positive, potentially negative, on individuals and their freedoms and rights. I mean, we're all in confinement. This affects our freedom of association, of freedom of movement, all of those things, right? So we all do want to get out of this, but we all do realize that if we get out of it too fast, we're back to square one, essentially. And there is a lot of very difficult problems, like the fact that it looks like young people, 15 to 25, probably should not worry too much about the epidemic for themselves. That's probably true, because they are actually, they tend to have less comorbidities, they tend to be more healthy. So it looks like the statistics are pretty good for that age group. So you could say, well, then let's try to imagine, right? I mean, all the young people would say, why are we stuck here? Why can't we go to the beaches? And we can just use the beaches for a while, just like make it easy for us to mingle and party at the beaches rather than stay at home for a while, right? Or enable some kind of freedom like this. Now, your teacher might not like it as much, because then he wouldn't necessarily be able to go to the beach anymore. but you could arrange things. You could try to figure out like different solutions there. But it gets very subtle, because one of the elements that we're seeing in some European countries is that when a young person does have an impact, a severe health impact, and we don't always know why they do, because we're still learning about this, then they tend to occupy the respirators, the critical medical equipment for much longer. And then it becomes very hard, because it's a question of, do we have one young person spending 14 days on a respirator so they can just live their life again at the end of those 14 days plus a few months of recovery? Or do we have instead 4 or 5 older people that use it for much less, but eventually die, right? Or maybe one will make it through. So these are real, critical, actual questions that are happening in some hospitals, or that were happening in some hospitals in Italy and Spain, and where some data has to be collected to make those choices. It's extremely difficult, and we can expect also those questions to propagate across other countries that are maybe less equipped in dealing with it, and where data will again become critical, and where some will arrive from Geneva or from big international organizations to offer help and start taking decisions about local populations in this way, because they're doing their best. They're trying to make the best decisions. But you can see that those decisions are deeply, deeply cultural as well. They have to be made with high criticism for how they are made. They have to be very open, very transparent, very accountable, essentially. And those decisions are medical decisions, but they are informed always by data. This is one of the key elements. And data that is not scientifically validated through the normal processes because everyone is acting in urgency right now. So you never have quite the certainty you need. Well, you're certainly far from it. Okay, I want to introduce, so that was the second core idea to get started, around understanding digital epidemiology and the shortcomings and the gaps, the blind spot. The third is understanding multi-scale ideas. And this is particularly relevant to the community aspect, the community branch of the work in
so the fourth group.
In the assignment, yes. So we can see that there is, in fighting together an epidemic, there is a part of egoism and there is a part of altruism. There is a part, and I try to highlight that kind of provocatively earlier. It would be very unfair for the young people to end up confined at home like this while everyone else is working and living their normal life. But there might be some altruistic reasons why this is asked from them, an altruistic justification why they should do it. And this is an extreme example, but you can find all kinds of altruist acts that we have to do in order to get out of an epidemic. Like right now, we're all confined. I suspect all of us think we're relatively, unless one of us has a comorbidity, we're all more or less probably not at that much risk ourselves in the face of the epidemic. But hopefully by now we understand the runoff dynamics of the epidemic that might affect others much more significantly. So it's a collective effort to actually restrict how we can live our lives, an altruistic effort. While on the other hand, there's also egoistic acts that do help surviving the epidemic or that do go in the direction of public health. That would be, for instance, the fact that if you're an old person, you just protect yourself. You just stay at home. You try to interact as little as possible with others outside, right? So this is you don't necessarily think you might need to go and help others or something. No, you just protect yourself. That's the best thing you can do. So why am I starting like this to explain like multi-scale needs in epidemiology? Because altruism is very hard to generate in people. You have to understand this as a very collective problem, and to understand what communities people identify with in order to feel altruism. If this virus, if I'm living here at home with my wife and kids, and potentially I could infect my wife, if I infected myself, I could infect my wife. If my wife is able to take care of the kids and I have space to isolate myself, I would isolate myself mostly out of trying to not to affect my wife and my kids, right? So this is altruistic, and this is a clear given at the level of a household. But if you're asked to isolate yourself because you might be a risk, it's unclear, but you might be a contamination risk for your country, this is too abstract to people. They don't register that. They don't understand it. It's way too hard for them to just see the relation and to accept this weight on them, on their life. But if it's for your neighborhood to be able to move more freely, because it's well internalized that if you're sick or if you're at risk, you should isolate yourself, etc., then things get a bit different. If it's your community, then it does get a little bit different, where the incentives are much more aligned with your own interests. Like this altruism helps you to eventually get out. So there are feedback loops that are very different here.
So can I ask you about this? It's something that I thought about, because indeed now focusing on the problem of contact tracing up, for example, which, by the way, we haven't defined yet. So we haven't defined it previously in any class. So maybe you might want to give an overview of that. But one of the key problems with the contact tracing apps approach is that you need a wide deployment. So beyond a certain percentage of people, I guess, of the population needs to be using in order for it to be effective. And then I saw a couple of days ago someone suggesting that a good way to increase the adoption, maintaining it voluntary, but increase the adoption, is to nudge people towards, towards using it in exchange for some clear benefits for them. So if you can make the case that the neighborhood, will be better, everyone will be happier in the neighborhood, they will have some positive consequence that goes beyond just helping the global population to overcome the crisis. That might be a good way of framing it. So it's some idea that I saw is they will run a lottery of people who are installing the app and letting it work, so that people will still voluntarily do it in the hope of getting this lottery prize, which goes a little bit in another direction, but it's still a way of nudging people. So this, I think, raises the point of how much we should be framing things to people in a different way in order for this to be more effective.
Right. So I think this is a very important point. And I've been working on all of those things since 3 or 4 weeks with Michele Loi, a friend of mine, Italian. Don't know if you know him, Nicolo, who wrote, among other things, or co-wrote the WHO guidance, so the World Health Organization guidance on surveillance in the context of infectious diseases, and the ethical guidance on the use of data in that context. And basically, in this context, governments have a huge amount of rights of surveillance of their population. And we were thinking, okay, I told him about the science. I explained as much of the science as I could to him. At some point, he reached the same understanding that I hope we all have now of this problem of pre-symptomatic transmission. Then he was like, okay, yes, the only way out is this constant surveillance from governments, unless we can offer an alternative that is based on consent. But then that's where governments are at right now. Let's develop apps that help people manage this, that help create this collective effort towards fighting the epidemic. Let's have people declare themselves as having had contact with someone else, so that when either of them becomes infected, we can directly identify them and everything. The real problem there is, what is the reward? Is it really a reward? Is it not a risk of punishment? Right? What are the fair incentives that you need to put? Because if people feel that they could be punished from this, they will never install the app, and you've failed. Now, think about a huge number of examples of populations. And actually, maybe this is a really good, I can do questions and answers, right? I can ask them questions as well. Yes.
Okay, sure.
So first of all, do you need a definition of what the contact tracing apps would do? Or are you good? You can signal good with your...
Is there anyone who would like to have a definition of contact tracing?
Or I can just give it. So,
yeah. Okay.
So the contact tracing apps, it's better maybe to start with proximity tracing apps. Mm-hmm. Okay, so proximity tracing apps, the promise is you have phones, they have Bluetooth. For reasons tied to epidemiology, people have moved on from using GPS essentially, because these surface transmission are relatively low. It's much better to understand contacts, and to tell people to wash their hands. So you use your phones, Bluetooth activated, and the Bluetooth. Some new apps are developed that allow phones to talk to each other, figure out, thanks to Bluetooth and the strength of the signal, how far away they are from each other. And so they record this. They have a log of which phone has been in contact with which, for how long. And then if one of us becomes infected, then this can trigger a notification into the phones that were close to the phone that belongs to the person who was infected. Okay? Yes? So the calculations from epidemiologists show that you need a huge proportion, as Nicolo said, around 60% of people in a population to install the app. I personally challenge the validity of those computations because they make a huge amount of assumptions that I think have a huge impact epidemiologically. But let's put aside that for a second. We can get back to it. Actually, it will become relevant later. But so then you need to get 60% of the population to install this app, right? So clearly, it's not going to work everywhere because not everywhere do people have that. Are there that many phones in circulation? So that's one problem. It's okay. It doesn't mean you need 60%. If you have a lower percentage, it already helps. But it's not a linear help if you want. So it goes like the square of the percentage of the population, essentially, to simplify, because that's the number of contacts you can actually hope to trace, essentially.
Yeah. So wouldn't it work more appropriately in clusters rather than thinking about the unique aggregates, right? You might want to have, at least 30% in the south area of Rio de Janeiro, where there's a lot of people living there. 30% is enough, and instead in in an area where which is much less densely populated, you have a different standard. I don't know.
Yes. So this is where you get to these multi-scale approaches, where it has to be made appropriate for the community, among other things. But this is where thank you for the question, because this is kind of you think differently about the percentage depending on geography, but our lifestyles don't depend on geography exclusively. We behave differently depending on all kinds of factors, or demographics, or work, what kind of work we have, or social patterns in general.
And importantly, I would say also the local infrastructure. So in now the Amazon region of Brazil, now they are desperate because they have very few ITU beds. So emergency beds, they have, I think, one respirator for a whole region of Brazil. So there, I would say maybe you want to have a much wider deployment, because the risk that you make by not having an additional measure to detect a possible infection can have much worse consequences.
But it might also be a huge task. What if you detect people and you can't give them the ICU beds? Because they're sick, you have detected them, and then what do? You just lock them up saying, oh, watch out, you might be infectious. But then you don't help them.
You will need to organize some charters from the Amazons to the another part of it.
It sounds easier to bring respirators to them.
So yeah, then you need to adopt that measure. But yes.
So yes. So let's not. That's a risk to get lost into digital measures without actually making sure to understand that first there should be a medical response, right? So if you can improve the medical response, then you're more likely better off. Although we see in Europe now that the confinement, the long-term confinement, is really impacting people's psychology and well-being, and it has long-term effects also on people's well-being. So there's they don't go to the hospital because they don't want to take that risk, and then maybe a cancer gets detected later or something like that. So that does have also impact people. But I want to get back to my question, which is, so we talked about these contact tracing apps and their deployment, and the fact that maybe you would want to deploy them differently, different numbers in different regions, geographic regions. Yes, definitely. But maybe you also want to deploy them differently according to origin, behavior, profession, all of those things. So, and maybe people will want to use those systems, if they're based on consent, differently. Maybe some subpopulation will not want to use them at all. So I would like to generate some ideas here. Do you have any kind of opinion? Like, what kind of subpopulation would want those apps, would not want those apps, would be very helpful if they installed it from an epidemiological standpoint, etc.?
I must say it's difficult also for me. Guess which kind of population Yeah, I mean, why not everyone? Everyone would. Yeah, no, I guess some people who depend on daily work, the commuting every day, they know the risk of being stopped by the application is too high, and they don't even want to engage with it probably. But other people who have a more intellectual profession like me that can stay at home and continue working, they don't mind, installing the app because it will not prevent me from doing what I need to live, right?
Exactly. So if you are a delivery worker and you actually need to go and do deliveries, you install the app, you get out of your apartment, you do 10 steps, and the app tells you, sorry, you'll have to do a test today. Then your day is gone. Your work day is gone. If it's Nicolo, well, he can probably go back home and get working again, right? So the impact is not the same on everyone. And as a consequence, the willingness to install is not the same either. Because it depends on how those apps are deployed. And this is still very unclear at the moment. Will it be in a punishing mode? Will it be in an empowering mode over the individuals? This is still, like, all kinds of governments are still trying to figure out those questions. And all kinds of civil liberties people are very carefully looking because they know which direction it could take. It could take a very punishing direction, which would have a lot of impact on people directly. I would like to evoke another population that would be very discriminated potentially by those apps. And actually, I'll illustrate with an example. Early in the epidemic, there was a Chinese tourist that went to Mexico. So going from the airport to his hotel, he took an Uber cab, and spent 2 or 3 days in Mexico. And then he went back home, taking an Uber again. Flew home. When he arrived home, he was detected as having COVID. Somehow, which I still haven't been able to trace completely, the Chinese must have informed the Mexicans that this tourist was infected. Somehow, Mexico must have managed to get data about the tourists' behavior, or movements when he was in Mexico, because the result was that the 2 drivers that drove his Uber were put in confinement, and so were, I guess, 238 passengers of those 2 Uber drivers in the 14 days around it. So this is also a form of contact tracing, but that doesn't involve an app. Uber has a health portal, a public health portal, like it has a law enforcement portal, where public health authorities can go and can say, hi, I'm a public health authority, here are my credentials. I need data about this person moving about, and because of a public health emergency. And then Uber, I suppose, delivers that data. So I can send you the link to the public health portal. I think it's lert.uber.com.
Okay, thank you.
So you see that this is a form of contact tracing. And this is already happening because this portal is already there. There's already collaboration between companies and nation states in dealing with this. But if there wasn't, and you asked an Uber driver to install an app, I can guarantee to you that the Uber drivers would very quickly learn that such an app would lead them not to be able to work, and that the population would very quickly learn, don't take an Uber because it has this insane propagation risk, at least from a digital standpoint, but quite possibly also from an epidemiological standpoint. So don't take it, because if you take an Uber, it's going to ping for you in a few days, and then you will be stuck home. So it's not going to be Nicolo getting out in the morning that will ping. It's going to be Nicolo taking an Uber 3 days ago that will make him ping now, right? So this is another example of potential discrimination. One thing that we see is that in the confinement now, in Europe at least, the rich people are home. Those who do need to work tend to be poor, or at least it's not exactly the same socioeconomic class. So we could have let the young roam more freely, but instead we let the poor roam more freely during the confinement here, which is already having a disparate impact. And after that, I don't know if this is one of the points in your assignments, but there will be also a problem around this idea of immunity passports, where people can get out and can get out of their homes and can, because they've had at some point COVID, and we've calculated that the risk is low to propagate again. So that will introduce also tremendously different impacts on people's lives, right? If you have this green card, like 2 of the students here have a green card that allows them to just roam freely, while the others are still expected to stay at home because they haven't had it yet. And they would know that if they have it, the consequences for them are very low, except that after 14 days, the likelihood of them being affected severely is very low, except that after 14 days, they'll get a green card that allows them to go out again. So it's going to be very hard to convince people to stay home if we have those immunity passports that come out.
Yes, we have something on this in the second group when
okay.
I think it's asked, to what extent can the state, or should the state, condition access to essential services, essential infrastructure on the use of an app. So it could be an app that creates an immunity certificate. That was the idea.
Yes. I would because of the governance, this is about governance questions. I would, from a pedagogical standpoint, I would very clearly distinguish the two though. The contact tracing and the immunity. The reason, the immunity passport, the reason is that the players are different here in interaction. So in one case, the contact tracing, it's about states monitoring social contacts between people, or contacts, graph of contacts between people. So it affects multiple people. And even states needing to know about contacts cross-border. So just to give you a concrete example, I'm here in Geneva. The border is bikeable distance to France. There is a hospital, right? The biggest hospital in Switzerland is in Geneva. Half of the staff crosses the border every day from France. So it matters tremendously for Switzerland that those people be able to travel freely across the border, but it does matter for France to be able to monitor how closely those people expose themselves to risk when they are in Switzerland, because those people are going to go home every night and going to infect others potentially, right? So that's the complexity of the contact tracing in terms of governance and access to data and utility of the data. Well, the immunity passport is different because it's more the relation between an individual and a health authority, and then the validity of this relation in the eyes of other states. So it's a different process of construction of this data, if you want, that opens up more opportunities for bilateral collaboration between states than the complexity of, because if you think, it's not just the problem that in Geneva, there are people being in contact with people living in Geneva and then crossing the border to France. There are also people being in contact with those that travel to Lausanne, and then from Lausanne to Bern, and then from Bern to Zurich, and then from Zurich to Basel, and then from Basel to Germany. And so it's a very complex multilateral problem versus a bilateral one of enabling individuals to cross a specific border.
Okay, I know. Yes? I just want to add, I think it's very helpful for students who are working on this data governance assessment to distinguish the two applications, the two goals of contact tracing and immunity certificate. But I would like to just highlight that there is some complementarity between the two things, because if you have been in contact but you just receive previously you were someone infected, and then you are in contact with people, but then you receive the immunity certificate that applies from a certain period onwards. Some notification would be false notifications, right? So the state needs to take into account those and how they interpret it, right?
The states, the nation states, they need to work together.
Yes.
Yeah. And so they need to work together, and this is actually a very good entry point for the next point that I want to make before we get to actual each assignment or each group project. There is something that is invisible in your assignment, and it's invisible in the thinking of many, many, many people right now. Although France is trying to surface the problem around contact tracing apps, that what is invisible is the infrastructure. The infrastructure is here. This is an Apple phone running an Apple OS controlled centrally in Cupertino, right? What is allowed here and what is not allowed is defined by Cupertino, but it's mediated through an app store that is based in Swiss rules here. So which app you can deploy in which country is going to be very complex and dictated by local laws. Which level of infrastructure access on this phone does each app have is going to be determined in Cupertino, right? So it's a very complex game between the infrastructure layer and the apps themselves, the platform and the apps operating on top. And if you think it's invisible, if you don't think of it, then each country will start developing their own solution. If you do think of it, then you don't develop the same types of solutions, because you know what kind of convergence will have to happen to make all of those systems work across boundaries. So one observation is that so far, nation states have started to think, in Europe at least, as this is we want to have a French solution in France, we want to have a German solution in Germany. And we can see a huge amount of fragmentation now, like vertically integrated in a country, but the digital response is based on very different assumptions, and it doesn't interoperate, or there is little perspective for it to interoperate.
Perhaps
and so,
it's worth mentioning at this point, well, there is an effort by some thinkers, some scientists in Europe to create a pan-European approach, right? And there is a very controversial, the extent to which they are actually being open about it. So, but that's one way that also now Europe is trying to create connections between different communities in Europe. Is the European Parliament that published a toolbox towards a common approach in Europe towards contact tracing, right? And then obviously connected to what you were saying is countries think about their own approaches, but we need to think also about the global infrastructure. And here is where, in the absence of a global action by the international community, states together, what happened? The big tech, so Apple and Google, started rolling out their own protocols, their own ways of implementing a possibly interoperable system of applications where they are not, and I will ask Paul to say a little bit more about this effort, because it is where, we have seen the market going in many cases where the state had failed to regulate, specific aspect, in particular in relation to infrastructure, and the private sector, and in particular the big players like Google, Facebook, Apple in this case, they recognize that they have the scale and the network that would allow to create solutions that have a much wider impact and adoption. But there is a tension there, because it's not the state who is doing them. Everything is being defined by these two giants. So to what extent this
right.
is
so this is true, but I guess it was a complex history. I mean, I can get into it, but basically there was a consortium of technical or there is a consortium of technical universities in Europe that got together, identifying early the problem of what is going to be the digital response. How do we ensure interoperability? So they started building this solution, or at least saying they were building this solution with high credentials. And instead of having a very open and transparent approach, I remember this is about building stuff that would be consented to, adopted by a large proportion of the population. Instead of doing that, they were very much opaque. And they were very much about interacting with governments and convincing governments that their solution was better. And in discussion with governments, I suppose, the outcome was a very centralizing solution, was this promise that to governments, like, we can build an infrastructure that gives you total surveillance of the population, and that gives you a complete visibility over what could happen in terms of transmission. So let's centralize all the data so we can run all the analysis we need. There were some, and this is where the infrastructure is really important, and part of the idea was also, let's replicate what was done in Asia. But our culture is different, but we'll have to do it that way because that's what worked in China or in Asia. So there is no other way out, basically. The Asians know better than us, and so we'll have to do it this way. So there was this approach. There was just one problem. The problem is around this phone precisely, and we go deeper into the infrastructure, into the Bluetooth antenna and the firmware and the access that is possible to this antenna. And the fact that when an app is open, the antenna can scan what it hears. So when an app is open, you can know what other phones are around. That's fine. But there are protections that prevent permanent scanning by the app. So when the app goes in the background, then it gets more complex. Some apps can still listen, but only some. And so that becomes very tricky and much deeper into the operating system. And what happened is that there's this other consortium, or this group within the PEP consortium, so this big European thing, that started saying, oh, do we really want to build a centralized solution to do this? A solution that centralizes so much data. Instead, we should be building, with data minimization principles in mind, a solution that tries to decentralize, that collects as little data as possible, centralizes as little data, and with as little impact as possible. We should have a very decentralized protocol. But we have the same problem. We don't have the Bluetooth access that we need. Through some means that are quite unclear at the moment, but I'm sure it will become clearer over time, the giants decided to follow that protocol and implement the extra API access that were needed to be able to do the scanning in the background that was needed. So if you have to go all the way to the firmware of the Bluetooth interaction with the operating system to actually be able to do that change. So that's why I insist so much on the infrastructure. And they became sort of kingmakers on the protocol, and the protocol then has huge impact on how the data is collected, what can be done with this data, and so on. Now, two very important elements. And now France is really locked into, like, just an hour ago, it was just completely exposed that their strategy is hitting a wall, because the giants are saying, no way, you cannot get such deep access that you want to be able to scan with a centralizing solution, because it might have huge privacy impacts. So we'll never give you that. And France is saying, basically, now, we can't do the public health interventions we want because the giants are refusing. So they're really looking for a confrontation. Another aspect that is important is the fact that I simplified by saying Apple, because there is also Google phones, Android phones, right? And Android phones, they're not all Google phones. Android is at the level of the operating system. So you have to go even deeper at the hardware. In the Android phones, the hardware and the software are decoupled, which is not the case in this here, because this integrates the two, right? So on the Google side, you also have problems of infrastructure, of accessing the firmware, of all of that. But there you bring in new players. You bring in Huawei or things like this with the whole OS layer of Android and all the permission systems and all of these things. So it becomes basically a situation where in the decentralized protocol, you have those big multinational firms that are restructuring power that has been constructed over decades within the walls of the WHO. And within just a few phone calls, they are reorganizing that power massively between nation states. And they are literally affecting the life of millions of people living in France right now by just saying, no, I will not activate this little flag in the App Store, or no, I will not, code this API for you. I'm trivializing the problem here, but it's they have a huge amount of control, and you have to understand this as well in order to understand how those systems are developed. And I want to go back to this moving target idea that you said. France wants to have a very centralized approach with the data, which is very French. It's deeply French, it's deeply cultural to be centralizing all the information. People are still free, but all the information about them, all the decisions are taken in Paris. That is just the French way to do things. And there might be good reasons for it. This is a completely moving target. If you want to understand the questions of discriminations, the deep questions that I tried to explain before, you will need to have, or at least they feel they need to have a deep understanding of this, of the contact patterns between people, of the social patterns. They need to really understand the social graph of the population in order to be able to take the best measures and to make sure that the digital measures they take are not discriminatory. Or at least I'm building this narrative, and this narrative could be plausible. It could be. And it could be a justification on why they do want to centralize data. And the French are used to trusting central authority to some extent, so it's culturally, it fits better. But it doesn't fit the culture of Cupertino or Mountain View, Google and Apple, to allow this. So there is a clash, and the French are looking for that clash. They're trying to say, we have French engineers who have devised a better solution than they can. They've given concessions to others. They don't want to give it to us, but it's a question of national sovereignty. So they are trying to blend those topics.
Sorry, they have given the permission?
So Google and Apple have given permissions for decentralized systems, which make deep sense in Switzerland, which is a highly federal state. Yeah. Would make sense in Belgium as well, will make sense in small countries that have solutions that are maybe more easy to deploy. But they refuse to have a centralized approach in France through these apps, or to improve, like the model in France is, let's do like Singapore, but solving the technical problems. And then Apple and Google arrive and solve some of the technical problems, but not the French technical problems. And the French don't like that.
To some extent, I do sympathize with Apple and Google in making this choice, because they might be potentially co-responsible if some state engages in some re-identification and misuse of the data because of the centralized authority that was given to it under some kind of contact tracing app. Then the liability is defined in the law. You could be a joint controller of those activities, and it could be liable to pay compensation in court. Whereas if it's a decentralized approach, you can basically wash your hands, say, I've done enough on my side, and I've ensured that I've given something that is not going to lead to abuse. So I feel better with it, right?
Yeah, but I think it's I'm not quite sure I agree with some of the simplification I might have made. So it's not about sympathies. We are lacking the global framework to address those problems, I would say, to make sure that we can bring those big giants to the table and have a democratic conversation with them. It's not just about convincing, it's also about forcing them sometimes to do things they might not like, but that have been democratically decided.
Yes, it was just a practical point on the possible answer that they would give.
Yeah. But I think that's the more important point that France should be trying to make. And there should be then from there some assertion of what is the scope of sovereignty and what is the scope of, in the context of an epidemic around data, like how are we going to define that? And then maybe we need to build a legal framework very quickly so that Apple and Google can be forced to do things by the nation states if it follows their own local rules and human rights principles, international law, etc., right? So maybe Apple and Google can be forced to do some things, and part of that forcing them is removing the liability for the outcome, possibly, right? But I do believe that we can build a process of laws and negotiations around those things. Okay. So we have how much? 19 minutes left?
Yeah.
What would you like me to do? Should I go through each point, or is that enough, or open for questions? I'm definitely open for questions.
Yes, I think, anyone that is working on one of these groups might want to ask, might have some doubts about their exercise. And, Paul Olivier is the person that can give you not only the lawyerly perspective, but the much broader community engaged perspective, and also the technical perspective that we often lack in assessing these things. So I guess your effort has been mainly around bottom-up type of effort, community approaches to this. I mean, now it seems that it's a little bit broader, but what I've seen you doing with the My Data community, which we haven't mentioned so far, is focused
Right.
on that bottom-up part. So maybe you can comment on that. And that relates to the fourth group, which, if you scroll down, is what you wanted also to suggest, make this practical, right?
Right. So I do believe that this is the right way. I do believe that this is the community-led approach, with states and giants and everyone understanding that this should be driven by individuals getting together or not to solve this epidemic, right? So the social response should evolve, should be quantified, and should be optimized partly for and should be held accountable. Very important, of course, in order to get out of this epidemic in a fair, humane, successful way. And this is all should be quoted with a ton of question marks. But if you think about Uber drivers, you think about refugees, you think about all kind of different professions, all kind of different groups, homosexuals in some countries that might be more discriminated, all kind of situations. They're never going to install, probably for good reasons, a government-mandated app. The British cabinet would never install a government-mandated app, I bet. But they were all infected at some point, or all in quarantine themselves, right? So it's going to be very hard to convince people to install those apps unless they can trust who they're confiding some parts of their social graph to, or power over them, essentially. So I do believe that this, because of the numbers, because of the virology, and because of experience in the past with epidemiology, these community-led responses are the best. So in my view, what should happen is that the App Store would lift some restrictions, would say it's not just countries that can approve the apps locally, but it's also health authorities that transcend borders. Maybe some agency in the European Union would do that as well. That would facilitate cross-border transfers. Then that would raise the prospect of more apps emerging that account for more situations. Then it would also open a different discussion with the tech giants on what do we need to make this work for the different communities, what kind of APIs. Like, it's not just a question of centralizing data into states, but moving the data to communities that are able to handle the governance problems, etc. So with all of this thinking, I came to, and with Michele Eloy that I mentioned earlier, I came back to My Data, to this community of people that Nicolo is also part of people who care about personal data, empowerment, individual empowerment around personal data, and to express this idea that we should have a commons, like in number 3 here, a commons around personal data that would be very time-bound, very limited in time, around COVID, not extend into something like forever. And that would be about being those intermediaries of trust in the data collection. I've been myself less active in this because I've seeded the idea and enough people believe in it that they are now pushing it. They're now working on it on their own, which is great, because then I can do other things, which is trying to shift the perspective from this state-centric approach to and focused on security debates, which are not necessarily highly productive. So debates around security protocols. Try to shift this a bit by having a different approach. I should say one more thing is that I'm extremely arrogant in thinking that my math background, I'm a mathematician by training, equips me well to deal with the mathematical problems underlying the epidemiological problems, and equip me well to better understand how network dynamic insights, the insights on how stuff spreads over networks, might be shaped by social insights in order to win on both fronts of limiting the propagation of the epidemic while at the same time enabling us to live more full lives than we are at the moment, let's say. And we should never discount either the objective of economic recovery and so on and so on. So this is a very complex assemblage that I think can only be solved from the bottom with a wide variety of insights, wide variety of expertise pulled together. So I'm in contact with mathematicians that I have in my own networks. I'm in contact with others who are ready to follow those ideas. The My Data community is also across border. It's very much civil society oriented, but crosses borders very easily. So the point is also to make this like emerge from the bottom. And I'm pretty convinced that it can emerge very fast. So the two next events that I have on my mind, and then I'll stop, I guess. On Thursday, I'm giving a talk on data governance. So in Geneva, there is an event that was organized a long time ago, leading to something called the World Data Forum later in the year. So they have those data governance talks that I'm talking at. So there's going to be a representative of Microsoft, of ICRC, Carmela Troncoso, the lead engineer on this decentralized protocol, was supposed to talk. She had to cancel because she's very busy. So this is a stage where I can push some of those ideas. And then this weekend, there is
Paul, will this be live streamed or recorded?
So that's what I was just asking. That's why I was late. Sorry, I learned this just before. So yes, it seems like it will be live streamed.
Excellent. So
and then this week,
actually a presential event even at this time?
No. But it seems like they wanted to be. It was planned as a presential event. So they're still. It's a bit strange. They've made a guest list, a closed event for asking questions, but it will be still streamed.
Ah, okay.
Okay, that's their setup. That's fine.
Maybe you can share the link with us so that whoever wants can join.
Yes. So that's one, and then the other place to make things advance is this weekend. There's been a ton of hackathons of like technical people getting together, let's solve problems and so on. Like crazy numbers. I think in Germany it was 30,000 people who volunteered a weekend to work on stuff to help with COVID. And then it's propagated from there in all European countries. And so now there's a bunch of different projects that are emerging in different hackathons. There's one that I'm very excited about called social contouring, trying to understand the sociology first to know how to open up, and tries to be data-driven. My goal is one of my goals is to open up the possibility that we could do contact tracing to better understand the sociology first before addressing the medical response. So this might be a way to start from the bottom, to understand, like, for each community to understand its exposure through contact tracing, and so to know progressively how they can open up. So I think that could be a very viable way in this federated way of collecting data.
What do you mean by open up?
So if you, right now I'm stuck in my household. If I want to be, for my kids to be able to play with the kids of the next door neighbors and so on, so that's opening up. And I think the most sensible thing, or to go to school, you know, to start building social relations again. But I think depending on what's opened up, it makes sense to look at these as, like, again, this multi-scale approach as communities that are distinct but do interact in some ways, and to trace how they interact to try to minimize the risk of exposure as we go further and further up. So we can do it by doing contact tracing, but we can also have a more top-down approach by doing sociological surveys and understanding the life patterns at the moment and how they are likely to evolve according to different measures that are taken. So that's what I mean by open up. So that's a big group that's working on its own. There are medical anthropologists there, sociologists, people who were in Vietnam when SARS arrived in Vietnam, right? So wrote a thesis. One guy wrote a thesis about it. He's now in Saskatchewan, in Canada, and applying the same methodology as we want to apply here in Geneva. So it's growing, and it's collecting data. So at some point, that data will need to go somewhere. But in this hackathon this weekend, so this is the European hackathon now, the European version, not the German, not the French, this is the European level one. So I want to really propose like this undermining contact tracing app that sort of undermines the state approach, that is much more horizontal, different communities. There are different regions in Europe where people cross border to go to work, to live, to like all over the place. This here is one example, but there are others. And so people there should be attracted to this idea that you should understand cross-border flows of people, which is an angle that, you know, one big government leader will not necessarily prioritize compared to another one. But a local, like if you're, I don't know, the British Prime Minister, you're prioritizing London. No, okay, so that was a bad example, sorry. If you're the French president, you're prioritizing Paris running again, rather than making sure that, you know, people at the border can actually cross easily. So the priorities are not quite the same. But for the local population, it matters a lot. For the local authority, it matters a lot that, yes, the economic activity in my department, my area of France, is not completely hampered because, you know, 50% of the population goes to work to Switzerland and is currently prevented from doing this. So those communities could be attracted to those ideas. Yes.
I would like also to leave some space for questions if there's any at the end. Yes. But first, I think this is an important one connected to what you're talking about. So in your idea, we would open up, we would allow access to certain data, for example, the contact tracing data, to an authority which is not necessarily the state authority, but some organization. And I think there, what is crucial is how we ensure accountability of this, of whoever is running the organization to the purpose that was stated, right? And this is not a question that should be absent also from inquiry in the case of the state, because it could be the same problem, you know, people who, as you were pointing out, who are in France and they want to favor one region of France over the other. That should not be in the mandate, you know, of governing the country. They're playing all sorts of secondary purposes as well into their reasoning. And I think it's important to try to design a system that ensures the accountability to purpose. And if we solve that problem, that would allow us to extend the application beyond this classic state authority concept, and we can expand it to the private sector, you know, bottom-up community and whatever.
But that's exactly right. So I think this is the mistake made in France at the moment, which is to combine different goals together. The purpose limitation is not respected. So they came up with a protocol that makes them face a wall. Well, I see the decentralized protocol as being very limited to doing contact tracing, but being extendable under consent and so on to actually expand the number of purposes, because it was so parsimonious in the amount of data that it collected at first. It means you can complexify things a little bit to achieve more objectives, provided you have consent and everything. It fits much better the pattern. And this decentralized idea is the right way to go because of the complexity I mean, this is a situation where data minimization is very crucial because it leads to very natural solution aligned with the problem at hand.
Yes, absolutely.
Questions? Definitely.
Questions. Yes. Take advantage. We just have him today and can be very useful. Must say here, today is also national holiday, so the students that are here are so enthusiastic that they accepted to have a meeting also outside the regular class time. So I really appreciate that.
Oh.
They make also a question that's beyond any expectation.
Oh, come on. No, but well, thank you. I didn't know I was forcing you to be attending a lecture like this on a national holiday. When we negotiated the time, Nicolo, I didn't know that. But yes.
Yes, I didn't know either when we negotiated. So
okay.
that's the problem.
You just in Brazil, it's like new holidays like that, or
no, it wasn't scheduled already for a while. But I thought that the whole week then would be cancelled. Instead, only Tuesday is cancelled, which is the day that I usually run the lecture. But in the other days, when I could reschedule the lecture, it was already taken by the other classes. So it was just making things complex to reschedule this. Okay. And I wasn't sure whether it would be available. Anyway, I'm happy we did it. We recorded it for whoever wants to go back later. I think it helps in structure and clarifying a lot of the questions that the groups need to ask. There's still many questions open.
Well, the goal was not to give all the answers to the homework, right, or to the project, but to help structure the thought. So okay, I feel like.
And
but I would really suggest to look at those problems with the what's hidden, what's behind the scenes, what is the hidden infrastructure, the hidden agenda, because this is shaping a lot of those conversations. And they are surfacing now, partly because of what's happening with France, but it's also like crucial matters, and it will only become more crucial when you go to, one step up, when states actually start to get together to try to solve those problems.
Yeah. So the one comment that you made is to make it more concrete, more practical. You suggest that we should connect to the community and get the questions for group 3 that are already being asked. Is that
yes? So in group 3, so this about data collaboratives. So in the assignment it says data collaboratives like Trace Together. I'm not so sure the Singapore app, so Trace Together, is that much of a collaborative. It's very much, it seems, state mandated, but I could be wrong, and it could be that actually things are evolving. It would be very interesting. If you learn this, please do let me know.
I understand Singapore, that it was imposed upon the population in Singapore. Well, not really imposed, but it was heavily promoted in Singapore.
Well, it's going to be the same everywhere.
I don't know. Yeah, it's a protocol that can be used everywhere. The tracing together. Now in Singapore, it's funny that they promoted it a lot, and they managed to get 11% of the population using it, which is very little.
And now they're facing problems again with resurgence, because it seems like the virus is spreading in migrant workers' dorms. So, I mean, you have to think about that, right? So there are populations, there are refugees. There's a refugee center nearby to here, holding Afghan and Eritrean refugees. How likely is it that they will install an app like this? And bless them, they probably will not want to install an app. They've been tracked all the way to Europe, to where they are here. They've been tracked by authorities. So why would they install an app, right? They're young, they have very little perspective, professional perspective. They are already almost in jail right now. So, I mean, before COVID, why would they? But they're probably contributing to spreading the disease. So in a sense, we're trying to find digital clutches on inequalities we already have. So it's
But yeah, this is actually one of the questions that we sort of only discussed here, the case where basically this is all voluntary. But there might be states where this is a decision that is made, that I think Australia has been talking about it. Either contact tracing or immunity certificates are mandatory or something. So yes, things could go even in that direction. And what could be the data protection legal basis for doing that? Like, also the idea that consent is the basis for processing that is contact tracing, implicated by contact tracing, is to be discussed by students in this assignment. So you could argue that the consent in this case is a weak basis because it's not really voluntary by everyone. It's connected with the previous issues. There are other legal bases that can be used. So would that solve the problem, or would it make it actually worse, more complicated for states?
Right. So to look back on the discussion, so those questions are questions that this MyData Commons group is asking themselves, and they do want to, I mean, they're trying their best. There's a real effort to have something like this in Switzerland. There is a real effort to have something like that in England. But they do have questions. So to get your input, to get your questions as well, would be, for that group, would be very, very helpful. And I'm happy to orient you with an email to the right place.
Okay.
I'm happy to also take questions by email to answer, to clarify. I'm available not just to Nicola, but also to the students if they wish.
Wow.
And yeah.
Thank you very
much. I'm looking forward to the results.
Okay, we'll share the results for sure. You can connect with us on the day that they're making their final presentations. That would be interesting. Yeah, if you are, available.
Yeah, if possible.
Day, of course, because Paul Olivier is very, very busy, and so thanks so much for being available to give this run through many difficult issues, and also for making yourself available for questions. That's amazing. Yes, I think we are all in a way working together, putting together efforts to find more efficient and sustainable solutions. So hopefully you students as well can contribute to that in your assessment. And Paul Olivier will give us links to these documents that he's been referring to, including this community driven effort that everyone is free and welcome to join. Yes. So,
or even the hackathon this weekend, even the European hackathon this weekend.
Yes.
Because that group is also working there. So if you feel like you have nothing to do on the weekend, just pop up at the beginning, and if it's not for you, you don't have to stay, of course. So
you can't say that this course is not giving you enough opportunities to be engaged. We're definitely providing you plenty. But yes, so in the next class next week, we're going to maybe make sure everyone has understood what the task for the group is. And from then on, I will assign you to deal with the monitor for this course. He will help you, giving you some literature that you can use, maybe making your assessment. You can collect your questions and ask to the monitor, and then he will report them to me. So that will make it easier, to make sure that step by step you're understanding and I'm following along with all the major problems that you're facing. But yeah, so thanks again, Paul, and I'll see you all in a week's time.
Not me, but thank you.
You,
thank you, all of you.
Yes. But we'll be in touch. Thanks a lot.
Hopefully we see each other in person in the next year or two. Yeah.
Yes, I hope
all right.
So. Okay, thank
Bye-bye.
you, everyone. Bye, thank you. Okay, stop recording.